So good afternoon from London, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just take a few moments to let everybody join the call. So good afternoon from London, but I know we have people joining us from lots of different countries today. So good morning, good afternoon, or possibly even going into the evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to today's webinar, which is called How Policymakers Can Unlock Growth for Entrepreneurs and Small Businesses Through the Power of Data Insights. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum that works with civil servants all around the world and with our knowledge partner today, which is Visa. So, in terms of the topic of today, it's safe to say that economic growth is a priority for lots of governments around the world in very challenging conditions for public sector. And now more than ever, I think actionable insights from data, including consumer spending insights, can really help policymakers to make informed choices to support economic growth and help entrepreneurs and small businesses, which are often the backbone of many global economies. So in the session today, we're going to be exploring how governments are using traditional and new data sources to inform economic policy making, including looking at how data can help governments to understand trends and design effective policies, maybe sharing some success stories as well as some of the challenges that governments are facing in harnessing data to help with their economic growth strategies, talking about some of the innovations in data and the latest tools and techniques that are helping governments to understand economic activity, and also touching on things like the importance of privacy and security and what some of the strategies are to ensure data is protected. We have four fantastic speakers with us here today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers and then start a conversation on the panel by putting a few questions to our speakers. But we want this to be a conversation with you, our audience, as well. We want you to engage as much as possible during today's webinar. So somewhere on the device you are using, you should see a Q&A button, a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A button at any time from now on to message in any questions that you have, any comments that you have when you're listening to our speakers, and we'll put those to our great panelists and get through as many of your questions and comments as we can before the end of today's conversation. So let me introduce our speakers. So first we've got Thomas Ramoletti, who is team leader for data management and analysis in the DG for internal market, industry, entrepreneurships and SMEs at the European Commission. And before joining this DG, Thomas was the programme manager of the Customs Control Equipment Instrument, a new £1 billion programme of the 2021 to 2027 multi-annual financial framework. And he's also previously worked in the DG for Human Resources and Security in a variety of organisational development and change management projects. Prior to working in the Commission, Thomas worked for multiple NGOs and a number of organisations in both the public and the private sectors, so has that wide breadth of experience. Then we will hear from Ramil Basul, who heads the Tourism Development Planning Division of the Philippines Department of Tourism. And Ramil has been with the ministry for over 18 years, and in his current division, he's in charge of formulating and implementing national tourism policies and communicating them with partner agencies. Ramil leads capacity building on development planning and statistics for destination managers, and he's also involved in routes development, which aims to increase the inbound visitor market of the Philippines through the opening of new air and sea routes. So a really exciting area that Ramil's working in. Then we come back here to the UK, where we'll hear from Emma Hickman, who is the Deputy Director for Local Statistics and Analysis in the UK's Office for National Statistics, the ONS. With a background in applied mathematics, Emma has expertise in senior leadership of teams who develop more granular and timely statistics, developing new geospatial insights that support the evidence base for local growth and devolution. And Emma has been in the UK civil service for over a decade. And in addition to working in the ONS, she's also worked in the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Education during her time in the civil service. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Robert Walls, who leads the products and solutions team within Visa Government Solutions, who's also based out of London, where I am here in the UK. And Rob has responsibility for building fit for purpose product and payment solution capabilities to support public sector payment needs. His previous positions at Visa included head of products and solutions for the UK and Ireland market, leading the Asia Pacific product and solutions hub team and the product and digital team for the Australia, New Zealand, and South Pacific region. So really has that global perspective and experience. And Rob has been involved in the payments industry for over 25 years. So I'm sure you'll agree, we have fantastic speakers with us here today. As I mentioned, please do make sure you get involved in this conversation. Put your questions, comments, thoughts, anything that you like to our speakers as we're going along using the Q&A function, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. But I want to kick off the conversation. I've got a kind of general opening question, really, that I'm going to put a version of to all of you. And Thomas, I'm going to come to you first. So obviously, we're talking about data and data insights. So I just want to ask you, really, where you sit in the European Commission, what's the type of data that you're using? How is that being used to kind of help policymakers? And how has that evolved over the recent years?
Yeah, so I'd say a lot of the evolution of the data that we're using has that I've been feeling is in regards to the use of data purchased from other data brokers and coming from directly companies in order to better inform ourselves because we were in a situation where at a certain point you can't always be depending on the statistics that are coming through the regular and traditional means that come with a lengthy delay and they come with a reliability behind it, but at the same time, it's difficult to inform policy making if you have data points that are looking too far back into the past. When you combine it with data that is coming from other sources, you can bridge the gap a bit, and that's been helping us quite a bit, as well as it doesn't necessarily mean that you're fully utilizing those data sources without taking to advantage those that channels that already existed. What we've been doing is taking the existing data points we have, combining it with data that we're purchasing from other sources, and using the different evolutions and the past history and analysis of evolutions to do some nowcasting and forecasting. And that way, we kind of try to get a better perception of where things are on a more up-to-date basis, and we don't feel like we're as dependent on this notion that we need to look back too much and that we're not able to be as currently aware of what's going on at the exact moment. And this way, it's much more effective for us. And it's also
Thomas,
a bit, go for it.
no, I was going to say that's really interesting. So you're saying you're still using the traditional kind of data sets and data points that you use. That's the foundation. But now increasingly you are purchasing in other kind of data from external providers. We're interested to hear what Rob thinks about that in a moment. And that's providing you with a different type of data, kind of more up-to-date data, and that together those are giving you a better kind of picture that helps
Yeah.
you with some of those policy insights.
Yeah, and also using it in combination with the methodologies for analyzing trends and evolutions and carry out some proper nowcasting and forecasting. And to be honest, if I might be so open as to say, in some cases, we're quite proudly of ourselves. These data sets that we were purchasing, then we were using, and then we kind of started carrying out our own analysis of historical data and implementing some methodologies, and we were coming to extremely close results of those data sets that we were purchasing, which likely indicated that perhaps the data brokers were using similar methodologies. So it gives us quite a bit of confidence. And we also keep checking back to the results. So when a new year's or a new month, depending on the regularity of the data that we're talking about, gets made available, we check back our previous forecasts to see how close or not we were and try to adapt our methodology accordingly. And we keep improving on it. And we're quite proud that we're getting better and better results. And even our initial results were already getting quite good.
Mm. That's really interesting. So the having that new type of data is helping you to kind of reevaluate some of the forecasting you did in the past and
Yeah,
increase your confidence that what you were doing was effective, or you're tweaking it to make sure
yeah,
that it is more effective going
yeah.
forward. Yeah, really
No, it's
interesting. Thanks, Thomas. I'm going to come back again in a moment with some very specific questions on maybe kind of some of those issues around the delay and the type of gap you said that you were bridging. But Ramil, I'm going to come over to you with a similar question. So you sit in the Department of Tourism. Can
Yes.
you tell us the type of data that you're using? And similar to Thomas, how have you seen the kind of evolution of how data is being used where you sit in the tourism department
Yeah.
in the Philippines?
Yeah, I think much like in any other institution here in the Philippines, we are very much dependent on data in the formulation of policy and programs. But we have established some information systems based on the recommendations of UN Tourism Statistical Framework. During the pandemic, we were forced to innovate and digitalize the process of counting visitor arrivals to the Philippines. And we are happy to share that this dramatically lowered the lead time for the release of visitor arrivals from 45 days to 1 day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we have also been talking with our partner agencies like the Philippine Statistics Authority, which is our national statistics office. They're handling the compilation of tourism satellite accounts. And our secretary, our minister, would like to see a more robust tourism analysis, more inclusive tourism analysis, especially with regards to employment and job creation. So
Mhm.
we're talking to them about that. We've also been making strides in making our local destination data better. We have been in partnership with other ministry so that we can not force but we incentivize the gathering of data in the subnational destinations. And with our conversations with our data providers, they assure us that it goes beyond really the incentive, but it is the understanding of the importance of data in decision making. We also recognize, of course, accessible information, and that's why we're developing online systems and which is going to be accessible to our stakeholders like the tourism establishments and also our visitors, no. And much like Sir Thomas, we have also procured data from advanced data analytics solutions that make our data more robust. But we're still starting about that, and it has been useful in our route and market development.
Mhm.
And yep, we do recognize the importance of data, especially those that are near real time. And we do want the data to be available to our stakeholders, and we would continue developing our capability system-wise and of course from the perspective of workforce capability.
Ramil, thank you so much. And I'm assuming that for a country like the Philippines, tourism is such an important part of
Yes.
kind of overall growth strategy that data in that particular sector is really, really important. So interesting some of the key issues you picked up there. The pandemic forcing innovation. I think that's something we've heard from other events that we've done, speeding up those processes, speeding up the digitalization kind of processes in general. But as you say, they're using your data to create more robust and inclusive kind of analysis, in particular looking at job creation, also looking at that local destination data, and then
Yes.
mirroring, I think, what Thomas said in that you're wanting to get more immediate data, more up to speed data, and linking that to the more traditional kinds of data
Yeah.
that you were already using. So thanks, Ramal. Thanks, Thomas, already. Now, Emma, I'm going to come over to you. And in the ONS, I guess you sit slightly differently. You sit outside of a department, so you're not in a central government department. But could you tell us the kinds of data that you are using, and also has that evolved in the ONS as well over recent years, and what's that change been?
Yeah, look, I'm absolutely really happy to talk about this. We face constant demand for faster and more up-to-date statistics for exactly the reasons colleagues on the call have suggested. But we also have increasingly been facing demand for more local statistics as well. And so a lot of these types of data that we're talking about today don't just help us to be quicker, they can quite often help us to be more granular as well. So traditionally, the ONS has kind of, developed its national statistics on the basis of surveys. We saw through the pandemic that response rates to surveys have started to decline. And we are really needing to shift towards using more kind of, we call it administrative data in the UK, but it's data that's collected through other means that can tend to be quicker or more granular. And I just give a few examples. So for example, we have developed very, very granular level of estimates of gross value added, which is a measure of productivity. It's a sort of precursor to productivity estimates. At the level of about 400 to 1,200 households. And kind of as Thomas suggested, we've also had to think about the methods to do that. So, we've used a relatively straightforward apportionment method to do that. But actually the sort of small area estimation methods would be important as well. And we've used VAT data to do that. So tax data from revenue and customs. And we are using other tax data increasingly. So another good example of where we've used administrative data recently is we have a data asset in the UK called LEO, Longitudinal Educational Outcomes Data. And that takes information from the school census, from how pupils have achieved, and links it to earnings and tax data that we have from HMRC, as well as benefits data from our Department for Work and Pensions. It only, that has limitations. We've only got that data linked for everybody. Well, I say everybody, it's not everybody, but it's, for a large proportion of the population under the age of about 30. And we've used that to look at the geographic mobility of young people and how they achieve in towns. We have been collaborating for a number of years with private sector organisations, including Visa. And during the pandemic, we were, again, like others, we really kind of needed to be innovative. We needed to kind of speed up. Though we were working with these organisations before the pandemic, it really kind of forced us to speed up the way that we were working together. And during the pandemic, we used Visa data along with other financial transactions data providers. So we were also working with Barclays, WorldPay, Revolut, and we were providing, kind of weekly reports into the centre of government on the impact of various restrictions on consumer spending. But we also use that information to model, for example, our international passenger survey to have that insight on tourism at a time when our field force weren't in airports and airports actually collecting the data. We also used it to help with understanding the impact of policies, like we had this Eat Out to Help Out scheme here in the UK, where people were kind of encouraged to go and eat out in restaurants at sort of discounted prices in order to sort of try and boost the economy locally as well. So we were able to see all of that in some of that data. And then the final one and we're starting to kind of use that more and more, and I can talk about how we're continuing to use financial transactions data across our statistics in a bit more detail. But the other one I just wanted to mention is on our prices statistics as well. So for example, we used scanner data. We do use scanner data on a regular basis to understand not just the changing prices of grocery items, but also changes in what people buy. And that helps us to improve how we measure inflation. And we can also, we've also web scraped data, for example, to look at how the cost of living during a period of high inflation might have changed people's habits, including the prices of low cost grocery items to kind of see how that played into the cost of living. So hopefully like a few different sort of examples there.
Emma, thank you. That's really, really interesting. So I think interesting to hear what you said at the beginning, that you're getting asked increasingly for kind of faster but more local, sort of granular statistics as well. So not just quicker but more granular as well, mirroring what Thomas said around looking at the methods that you use. So you're getting all these different types of data sets now, and how do you bring all of those together? Mentioning some of the different types of data there, the tax data, administrative data, looking at the Leo data that you mentioned as well. So, and the different areas that it can be used in. So you mentioned there a couple of them. Interesting through COVID, I think that the need for that quick data, because policymakers were having to make decisions on almost a daily basis. So they needed to know the impact of decisions very quickly, actually. And is there a legacy now for that, that ministers want that very quick, maybe kind of analysis as well, carrying on? And then you've all now mentioned, so I'm going to hand over to Rob in a minute, but you've all mentioned the importance of partnerships, I think, with external kind of data providers as well. So thanks so much, Emma. And on that note, Rob, I'm going to come over to you. And I guess my question is the same one, but it's kind of prefaced a bit with what are Visa even doing on this webinar? So when we're talking about data, why Visa? I think a lot of people would think of you as the card kind of people. So why are you here talking about data?
Thanks, Siobhan. So look, I represent a function within the organisation called Visa Government Solutions, and our focus is purely to support governments with the digitisation of their economies as it relates to payments. Because we're present in more than 200 countries around the world, we are very privileged that we see a lot of data, a lot of payment data. Payment data is obviously an indicator of economic activity within those markets. And over the last decade, as we've seen more and more digitization of payments, whether people are tapping on to a bus or a train to go to work, they're ordering food on their phone after work on a Friday night at home, they're shopping on a marketplace to buy things rather than getting off the sofa and going out down to the local shops to buy. That provides really great insights in terms of just how an economy is doing or not doing per se. And we heard from Emma just recently around the impacts of COVID. That had two impacts for Visa. There was a spike in demand from governments to understand what is going on in their markets, and they did need that real time. But they also wanted to understand how did their recovery look like prior to the COVID period. So Visa holds data going back 3 years in terms of availability, and we refresh the market data that's available to our government partners on either a monthly basis or a 3-monthly basis, just depending on the size of the market and where they are in the world. That information is really, really valuable, and I think it is enabling governments to use it from a tourism perspective, and we've been supporting governments to identify who's coming to their market, how long are they staying, what are they doing in the nighttime economy, how long, how much do they spend in what particular areas, where do they travel when they arrive in those locations, and that's helping identify when and where to market your tourism location to your points of origination. I think that's become very valuable. The other insights have become interesting for governments around the small businesses within their sectors. Small businesses typically generate up to 95% of tax revenue for governments in many markets. They're often responsible for 50% of employment. And so our Small Business Health Index is helping governments to identify just how healthy are their small businesses. Are they increasingly attracting customers from beyond the location of their business? Are they doing more digital transactions, for example? Are they actually declining? So we do see small businesses drop off the network, and that's an indicator that they've gone out of business as well. But we also work at a macro level. So we've worked with the World Bank, who supported a government in the South Pacific to understand just where the tourism flows were coming into their market. And the output from that engagement was really to help the South Pacific nation to spread that tourism dividend further beyond the typical tourism destinations. And we're just talking now about tourism or transaction data, but when we're talking about all of the other data that's available because of the digitization of payments, we're applying that information in new ways from an AI perspective to help detect and mitigate fraud. And last year alone, we sort of helped banks stop about $41 billion of fraud globally as a result of application of
Yeah.
those technologies. So there's lots and lots of applications of data within Visa, and we can talk a bit more about that as we go through the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So really interesting to hear. I'm always fascinated when we get Visa on the webinars, just how much data that you gather, that you collect, and how useful that is for governments. And interesting what you said there, that COVID really spiked that interest from governments in using the data that you have, how you refresh your data regularly for people, so they are getting that more kind of timely, up-to-date information. And then, as you say, not just around kind of tourism, although that's hugely important for regions, not just countries themselves, but also, as you say, your small business health index, small businesses being such a crucial part of economic growth for a lot of countries. So how you can help in that area as well. So thanks to all of you for kind of setting the scene with that first question. To the audience, any questions that you've got, please start them coming in. But I've got a follow-up question for all of you on the panel. So I think you've all given some examples of how you're already using insights from data to help kind of influence policy and influence some of those investment decisions that policymakers have to make. Are there any specific examples you can give me of the types of decisions that you are helping policymakers with? So that's a question. Ramal, you are nodding there. I'm going to come to you. Any specific examples of where you're already using data insights successfully?
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna talk about the route development that we are working on. Our team is tasked to partner with airlines so that they can begin routes or increase routes to the Philippines, or with airport authorities for joint marketing and promotion. For our task, we are now using data that tells us which international market is rich for the Philippines but is not being served by airlines right now. So this signals us to formulate programs and sales missions that focus on these markets. By pinpointing specific markets to target, we avoid wasting resources on missions that are low yielding. And we are fortunate enough that we have experienced results for the past year, for 2023 and 2024, and our yield is positive for now.
Thanks, Ramil. So, really important point you're making there, that by using data in that way, you're helping policymakers to prioritize their limited resources so that they're not wasting effort in areas that aren't going to give them such a good return. So, a really useful way of doing it. Thanks. Thomas, back to you. Do you have specific examples of kind of where, I guess, you work with other countries across the EU where you are helping them with data insights, and what are the kind of policy areas that you're helping them in?
Sure, we try to collaborate a lot with the member states, but at the same time, I would say that it's quite important to look at the citizens and the enterprise in general and try to help them. Just recently, my team published a dashboard that's available to everyone. I shared that with the host and panelists, sorry. I'll send it to everyone. And essentially, it's a more outdated version because eternally we get to see more up-to-date statistics, but there you can see a bit with a delay of some market surveillance analysis. And so you can kind of see if potential products are distressed. And I think that's a good example of a word that's a bit relevant on both sides, because public administrations want to see the situation with strategic assets towards their country, and if they're in a potential distress situation, or they have to observe an overall trend where quantity is decreasing and price is increasing, or at the same time, enterprises might want to realize if they have products that are part of a value chain that is in potential situation where they need to be more observant, that's also relevant to them. And in general, I do think that it's good that all of us that are working in more public administration oriented roles try our best to kind of be as transparent as we can. And I try to make it so that we share as much as we can of the analytics that inform our policy making, because I want us to do it in such a way that one can understand where the conclusions have been coming from, and as well if I can be quite honest, a lot of times what happens with us in public administrations is that we'll publish these studies that are, 150 pages plus, which garner insights and help us policy making, but at the same time, we have it that we make them available to the public, but how much of the public is going to read those 150 pages? So I think that it's good that we try to make things available in a more visual and interactive way. We might think that, okay, but if someone's a professional in the sector, they don't need things to be that appealing. They have the professional instinct to follow it. But no, let's be honest, we're all pressed for time. We're all pressed for responsibilities. We need to make things as accessible as we can if we want people to actually use them.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I think that's a really important point because it's not just the data specialists. The whole point is that you're using the insights from this to help people who aren't data specialists, so help the more generalist policymakers and civil servants from other professions to understand what those insights mean for the decisions that they have to make. So thanks. I see you've shared your document now to everybody so that they can have an example of that. Thanks, Thomas. Emma, I'm going to come back to you. You did mention quite a few policy areas already. Do you have any other examples of where you are kind of helping people with their policy decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously kind of talked at length there about, some of the work we did with Visa during the pandemic, but more recently, we've needed to kind of support our Ministry for Department for Communities.
The names change so often at the moment. It's hard to keep
Give me a
tabs.
moment. DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. That's the one.
Yeah.
Who kind of own tourism as a policy area. And we, our tourism satellite account, which kind of shows the contribution of tourism to the UK economy, is lagged by 2 years. And obviously that kind of, if you kind of look back at that sort of time lag places, you're in the middle of the pandemic, and what they really wanted to know is, has tourism recovered? And we were able with Visa data to kind of look at face-to-face transactions in tourism industries using kind of a modeled home location and look at where people were spending in those industries to come up with some estimates that we've published recently. That's not the whole picture, but it has given the Department of Culture, Media and Sport like a good basis for understanding sort of economic recovery in the sort of sectors that they really care about. We are also working with the UK interbank systems provider called Pay UK and Vocalink. So they own faster payment system and our what we call our back system, which is the sort of interbank transfers. And we've been looking at that to try and capture flows between businesses, from consumers to retailers or businesses, providing new insights into key economic issues like the production network, supply chains, consumer trends, again, local economies, tourism competition, and so forth. So it's incredibly rich data, and sort of working with multiple kind of providers in the financial transaction space helps us to get a much kind of fuller view of sort of different parts of the economy. The other kind of one I wanted to just mention is that alongside financial transactions data, we've been working with providers of short-term lets platforms as well. And that really has helped us both to understand about local tourism, but also understand how hotspots might affect local economies through housing supply and also like seasonal variation with residents. That has quite directly will be supporting a policy that's being implemented to register properties that are used as short-term lets in the UK, to both help us understand the scale and the geography of that. I've got some information from Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, but it has kind of been feeding directly into there. And we also get a lot of interest from local leaders, from some of our mayors, our regional mayors, in that data as well. So yeah, a couple of examples there. And then the other thing is, I just wanted to echo what Thomas has said about making data available in a way that's kind of easy to digest. And one of the things we're really proud of, mostly because we also recently won an award for excellence in official statistics for this product, is our Explore Local Statistics tool, which I'll just post in the chat now. So this is a dashboard that brings together a huge range of indicators from across government, where you can kind of search based on where you are actually in the UK, and you can actually look for all of the statistics for the geography that you're in, rather than kind of looking for, you know, economic statistics over here, you know, statistics on housing, statistics on health, you know, from all different places. So it brings it all together.
Thanks, Emma. So really making it easy for people to access that information. But you also saying there, different policy areas coming together to create a picture of what's happening in a local area. And Rob, I guess that's where people come to you as well. What types of ways have you helped? And you mentioned some as well, but are there particular examples you want to share of where you've helped in particular policy areas?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo a few things from previous, travel is really important. Cross-border travel is just about back to where it was in 2019 by the end of 24. I think McKinsey's suggests that the economy it's worth about 9% of global GDP. So travel is an enormous part of the global economy, but 75% of travel is still domestic. And so where people are traveling in their own country is just as important, and that is feeding into investment decisions, into transportation links, into airfare versus low-cost airfare comparison issues compared to traveling on trains. And we've done some really interesting work here in the UK, but we've also done some interesting work in Japan and the Gold Coast in Australia. So the Japan Ministry of Economy and Trade were looking to drive increased digitization of payments in their economy, but they wanted to focus on a particular area because they knew tourists are generally higher users of digital payments. So they used Visa data to identify where people are traveling. They identified a hotspot in the country. They ran a marketing campaign with the local businesses to promote digital payments. And then they were able to track the performance on a monthly basis in terms of how that campaign worked. In the UK, we worked with an external consulting organisation who services regional governments. And those regional governments are trying to understand how are people living in my area using payments today or using funds today? Where do they travel to make transactions? That consulting company took Visa domestic transaction data. They also took mobile telco data. So they were able to understand how people were moving based on the anonymized data points from cell towers to say, okay, we know where people are moving in a particular area. How are they spending also? So combining those two things together, they were able to determine for this particular municipal government that because there was a lack of low-cost parking in a particular area, people from that area were actually traveling to another village, to a big box retailer that does have ample parking to make purchases there. They also helped model out the impacts of pedestrianising the high street, the local main street of the town as well. So that's sort of an indication as to how the more granular data we can get or we can provide to the governments, it can go back into policy inputs. Just lastly, access to data is not a given, not even within organizations like Visa or data organizations. You still often have to have skills to access the data and to be able to present it back. And that's something that we've certainly heard from many government agencies around the world. And that's really why Visa built in the last sort of 12 months a Visa Government Insights Hub, which I'll post a chat to later. But it basically helps government agencies identify macroeconomic insights related to their economies, microeconomic insights, a bit more focused, domestic travel trends, cross-border travel trends, and also small business health insights. So it does help surface from a data visualization perspective some of the data stories that that payment data can tell.
Really, I like the way you put it there, the data stories as well, because one of the things that we hear from civil servants is they now have so much data and so much information. Sometimes it's a bit overwhelming for them. So it's great that they can access it, but they need to access it in a way that they understand how they can use it and kind of identify the messages in all of the noise, I think. So really interesting that you're all saying how you present it is as important as just giving people a lot more data. Rob, I want to start with you on the next question because it kind of builds on from what you're saying, I think. So we're talking about all of this information that's now being shared. So it's being shared across private sector in partnership with the public sector. We're hearing different types of data now being brought together. Sometimes that can raise a bit of concern in citizens and consumers because they're worried about how their data is being used. And the more it gets shared, does it lose its kind of security? Does it become vulnerable to people accessing that data who they wouldn't want to access that data, for example? So can you give us a sense of how you and the public sector that you work with can reassure the public that their data is being kept secure?
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. And Visa, as an organisation, has very strict policies around data use. You know, we play a pretty important role in many economies, and consumers, businesses, governments, financial institutions, regulators, they trust us to do the right thing with data. Let's talk about what we don't have for starters. So Visa does not have personal information. We don't have name, date of birth, address, none of those identifying information to you and your bank account. We don't see any of that. We do see a 16-digit number, which is printed on the front of your card. But even then, we don't share that with any third parties. So we always anonymize and aggregate the data. We've got very strict rules in terms of ensuring that any information that's shared can't even identify a particular merchant in the ecosystem, for example. So we want to make sure that we're protecting both consumers' data privacy rights as well as merchants' data privacy rights as well. So we spend a lot of time cleaning the data, making sure that it's fit for purpose, and then we apply rules and models to then develop the insights and make that available, again, through a very strict compliance and data security control process externally.
Great, thanks. So there's no risk really that individuals can be identified in any
Not at
way.
all.
Ramal, you're kind of nodding along to that.
Yeah.
Do you have similar issues? Because I think if data gets kind of breached, if there are privacy breaches, you can very quickly lose the trust of the public. So what reassurances do you give the public as well their data is being kept secure?
Yes, that happened actually years before, decades before, when one popular destination, the establishments are sharing data with us, with the local government unit. But then another organization got the data and began taxing them with lots of using that data, so there's a mistrust. But right now in the Philippines, we do have a law that protects data producers and their users, and that law ensures that it protects the privacy of individuals, but it also ensures the free flow of information. So it addresses the needs of businesses and public entities in processing personal data, but it also has provisions that will uphold individual rights. So we are really very, very careful with that, and we always remind our data producers, with regards to the Data Privacy Act of 2012.
Thanks, Ramal. We've got a question coming from Aslak, which I'm coming to in a minute. But Thomas and then Emma, would you like to add anything on this issue of data security? Emma, I'll come to you first, and then Thomas.
Thank you. It's an issue that couldn't be more important for an organisation like the Office for National Statistics. We really do take it seriously, and it's really considered carefully in all of our working arrangements. The first thing I will say is that we have to have a legal gateway for any data sharing, and the data sharing agreement will set out exactly what and how the data can be used. I think we do challenge ourselves on whether we really need sort of transaction or record level information. Sometimes the answer is yes, because we need to link it to other data sources, in which case we have, very, very secure environment, very limited access, people who have got the right level of security clearance to access that information, to do that linkage before it then gets anonymized and made available for kind of wider analytical use. But often is the case, as Rob pointed out, that in fact we don't necessarily need, the sort of record level information. Quite often aggregated information, can be aggregated at such a level that it's still incredibly helpful in official statistics, but we don't really need the record level information, of individuals. And actually, we've got modelling methods and so forth that can help us to get these insights without necessarily risking the access of identifying information to individuals. When I talked earlier about developing estimates of gross value added at those really small geographies, small numbers of households, one of the challenges that we faced there was actually that some areas that are that small will have businesses in them that are economically dominant, and we don't want the information from for the businesses to be identified either. This is not just about individual data, it's about business data as well. And so we, actually probably the more challenging part of the methodology around that, because it was to automate our disclosure control and to come up with an algorithm to automate disclosure control that really reduced that risk of identifying any economically dominant businesses. So something that we have a lot of experience of, and we do take very seriously.
Thanks, Emma. Thomas, did you want to add anything? I guess what Emma was saying, yeah, I've been talking about losing the trust of citizens, but I guess losing the trust of businesses as well is really important when it comes to data security.
Yeah, I think that's quite relevant, because when it comes to data security, it's not just a matter of privacy, which obviously is quite important, but it's also about the general sensitivity and confidentiality of the of the data in of itself. And to be honest, I think that what Emma was saying actually bridges quite a bit the notion of data security with the question that the person asked on how to balance comprehensive data collection with risk of data overload. Because what she was talking about of making sure that you're not identifying individual dominant actors in the market or whatnot is exactly a way as well in which you can try to make sure that we are feeding policy officers and people working in policy making in such a way that it's not overloading them by supplying them with a level of aggregation where they can operate the data in such a way that it's still quite relevant, and that instead of it being that it's a static report, it's that you're working with self-service reporting so that they can select exactly the filters of what's relevant to them and not being pigeonholed into exactly what you thought made sense for them, and they have no say in what they want to look into. And that way you're also ensuring some security, because even if behind the scenes all of it is being calculated on the basis of microdata, you're only making available to visualize it on an aggregate level. And so you're enabling yourself to feed your policymakers with the data that they need on the basis of exactly what's the aspects that they need without jeopardizing security, because you are making it so that it works dynamically in accordance to the interactivity that the user is having. I think that it's it's already been a while that we've been moving on, and I think quite rightfully so, from that notion of, reporting is running a script so that it issues whether it's a PDF or a CSV or whatever it is, you send it by email and that's the report. No, it's about a self-service reporting that's available at any time through easy mechanisms, usually the browser, and the user can select exactly what's the fields that make sense to them.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, going back to the title, I guess, of today's webinar, which was all about how do you use the power of data insights to help unlock growth. So the question that Thomas referred to there, which has come in from Aslak, just to read this out for everyone that hasn't seen the question, was how can we balance the need for comprehensive data collection with the risk of data overload, ensuring that the data we gather is not only relevant, but also actionable for policymaking? So I guess it's a bit like what I was saying before. There's so much data. How do we help policymakers identify the data that's most useful for them and then get the insights from that data? Ramal, I'm going to come to you on this question.
Thank you, Shoban. I think for us data producers, it is always more is better, but we do have to make our research converted to something useful. So we have to filter data according to the policy issue it is trying to solve. And this must reach the decision makers. We are not the decision makers, but of course we have to provide our decision makers with the right amount of data so that they could decide with the right policies.
Yeah, thanks, Ramil. And Rob, this must be an issue for you as well, because you have so much data. Kind of to what extent do you select what you think is going to be most helpful for policymakers?
Look, we do see a lot of data. I think our starting point is a problem well defined as a problem half solved, right? So we always start from what problems are governments, or what challenge statements are governments trying to answer when our team is going out to talk to them, and that's really helping us to define defining the models that we build. So we've had requests around how do I get better insights to the sustainability of my economy. So we've been spending a lot of time looking at combining visa data and third-party data to provide insights on the sustainability of particular sectors in the economy, helping governments understand recovery after a natural disaster. So the first days and weeks are really critical, but then what does it look like 3 and 6 months after that period of time? And how can you make sure that we narrow the field of view to the area that was particularly affected rather than a very broad macro area? And so we're working with some of the NGOs who have also developed predictive models around natural disasters, especially actually in the Philippines, for example, where there's typhoons very regularly. We're trying to work with one of the NGOs there who is giving fishermen sort of 2 to 3 days notice that a really life-changing typhoon is coming, and to get funds to those people to protect their boats and their families earlier in advance of the impact. So it really comes down to problem definition. What data do we have access to? How can we partner with third parties? And we've got many examples of how we've done that around the world.
Thanks, Rob. Emma, similarly, when departments maybe come to you and say, we would like X, Y, or Z, sometimes do you wonder whether they have actually identified the problem, the question they're trying to ask, like Rob says there?
Yeah, I mean, of course, and often I think it's interesting because we do work a lot with central government departments in my area, most closely with the Ministry for Housing and local government and communities. And they will say, oh, you've got mobility, you've got mobility data, or you have financial transactions data, we want to see what's in there, and it's, we kind of end up going, well, but what do you want to see? And it can be a bit of a circular conversation. But what we have had the other kind of stakeholders that my team work with really, really closely are actually local government. So we're not just talking about central government here. We're seeing a move towards increasing devolution in the UK. We saw that through sort of levelling up white paper in the previous government. But we are, there were strong kind of commitments in the Labour manifesto that the current government will be sort of taking forward that direction. And so we're expecting to see more and more policy being made at a local level by mayors rather than necessarily at a national level. And we need to actually make sure that they have the capability to kind of use the evidence in their policy making. And quite often, there's much more variable analytical capability in local government compared to central government. And so we've got a team called ONS Local who are in region leads. And they are out actually kind of, doing that engagement on a regular basis with our local government stakeholders to say, what are your user needs? What are the problems you're trying to solve? How can we help? And they can help them navigate the sort of ONS landscape of data, but they kind of bring that human touch to, really, really like trying to pin down what is the real need here. And how can ONS support? And in some cases, actually, they do have the capability to use the data themselves in the best way possible. And it is about doing data sharing in the right way for them to be able to kind of take that forwards themselves. And sometimes it is actually about having that conversation about, You know, potentially they don't have the capability all the time. You know, they're all incredibly stretched for resource. You know, if there are opportunities for ONS to support, you know, how do we collaborate with them in the best possible way to kind of support them in getting the evidence to the decision makers in local government that they need to.
Thanks, Emma. I've got a question to the audience. I'm wondering, so I think we've got a mix in the audience of people who produce data and also people who might want to be using that data. So I'm wondering if any of you want to share what some of your biggest challenges are when it comes to kind of getting the data that you either produce or you need to the policy making people at the right time in that process to feel like it is actually being effective in the decision making process. So any comments that you want to send in, please do now. We've got a few minutes left. But to the panel, I want to say it's very rare that we do a webinar like this touching on data and kind of digitalization without the issue of new technologies and AI coming up. And I just want to put the question to all of you, how do you see the kind of deployment of AI changing the way that policymakers will require and use data in their kind of decision making? Rob, I'll come to you first because you might already be seeing this changing kind of things.
Yeah, we see I mean, AI is such a topical conversation. I think in the government transformation or digital transformation world, I think the biggest use case we see for data use will be predictive insights or predictive next best actions between governments and citizens. And so the most advanced governments who have invested in digital infrastructure, or maybe they don't have the technology debt that some of the other governments have, right? So they might be in a different environment, but where they have got shared data resources across government agencies so that a citizen can tell the government once something about them. The government then has connectivity to other organizations, health organizations around the market, so that when a child is born, for example, there is an AI-based next action for the government where they say, I'm actually, congratulations on the birth of your child.
Right.
We've now signed you up for child benefits for the next 6 months under that particular health policy. So I think that joined up government to citizen use of AI is going to be really transformational over the next sort of 10 years.
Yeah, so really helping to do that, joining up that I think government have been trying to do this for decades, but actually AI is going to be the thing that maybe helps with that the most. Thanks. And Rob, while you're there, we've got a question from Sarah, which I'm also going to ask everybody. So Sarah has said, how do you handle any instances of misuse of data that you publish? People can twist data to say whatever suits them. So do you ever intervene? Is this an issue for me? Because you don't publish directly your data, do you? So is this even an issue for you?
Look, as Emma was saying before, we have a pretty strong legal agreement with our partners in terms of how data can be used, and we have a review process that evaluates how data is being published, and so we sign off on that for sure. But there is always industry analysts or someone that might make a misinterpretation of data or a claim on how data is used. And look, we'll respond to that in the right way, depending on the level of error that needs to be corrected. Whether it does or not is another question. So it's a bit of a case-by-case basis, but we do start from a legal framework perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Thomas, I'm going to come to you as well. First on Sarah's question. So do you ever intervene if you know of people that are misusing your European Commission data?
Firstly, just so you know, there's a guest speaker here. But also,
very cute.
So there are instances where we can be asked to make corrections on what is said of our data use, but it's also a matter, I think, of you need to lay out your statistics and figures and data sets in such a way that it can be easily understood and comprehended. You're never going you're never going to be able to make sure that people will always come to the same conclusions as you. All you can do is try to lay out things in such a way and format that it's as self-evident as possible, and so that people can not misinterpret it in such a way that is dangerous. Obviously, people can make mistakes, and that's perfectly understandable, but it should be the result that things are laid out correctly. And that actually, I would say, in a way, also relates to what you asked on AI, because so we're using machine learning for interpretation of data to try to kind of sometimes speed up, for instance, categorization of some data sets where we have the information quite detailed, while we also use large language models in order to try to make it so that people can ask questions about the data in a plain way. So meaning, for instance, I was quite adamant about the notion of self-service reporting. And I think it's very valuable. But at the same time, there are limitations there. Someone has to select exactly the sector they want the data for. They have to organize it by the factor that they want. And there's limitations there. With large language models, you can have someone, instead of, choosing the sector in a dropdown and then sorting the chart by the measure that they wanted to sort by, just ask, okay, what is the biggest sector for the Austrian economy on the basis of their output and value added? And it, on the basis of using the large language model, it takes the data that you process, so you don't have risk there of hallucinations, because it's just interpreting the question, not the answer data itself. And the data is coming from the transformations that you made, so you can feel more confident of. Now, using artificial intelligence for the data in of itself, it does come with some risk. And so on that, you do have to be a bit careful, because it's even if you have hallucinations turned down to minimum, you still have the potential of something being reported incorrectly. And certainly for us that are working in public administrations, we don't want to be said that we reported those things when they're not a fact, but it doesn't mean it's not useful. So I'll share their link of
Thanks.
our colleagues and once again, I shared it in the secluded format.
You'll share it with everybody. Thanks, Tom.
No, I'll share with everyone.
Yeah.
And so this was developed by our colleagues in DGT together with other directorates general like Connects and Digit. And it has several tools that are made available to institutions, public administrations, academia, small and medium enterprises, NGOs, a whole bunch. And there's different tools there, like there's one for using AI for translation. I don't think I need to explain how that's useful, but there's also some for instance, summarizing large data sets, documents, and coming to a summary so that you can understand better. Now, that is not to mean that you don't still need to look at things. Anything that's generated by AI, I would always recommend you check it, because otherwise you're really running a risk.
Yeah, you can't remove the human entirely from this process.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Thanks, Thomas. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so I might not ask all of you everything now. I'm going to shift around a bit. But Emma, I do want, because obviously the ONS, how would you, I guess, respond to people who you think are misusing your data? That would be an obvious question for the ONS.
Yeah, thank you for that. Obviously in the UK, we have organisations like Full Fact who are doing a lot of fact checking as well. ONS is sort of one part of the UK Statistics Authority. The other part is our regulator, the Office for Statistics Regulation. We have multiple ways of responding. If we genuinely think just somebody in the media, for example, has made a mistake, we will tell our media team, they will ring them, they will, issue a correction. If it seems that, for example, ministers are not kind of stating facts correctly, then the Office of Statistics Regulation will generally get involved in some way or other, often writing a letter to the relevant department. So yeah, there's a fairly robust response from the Statistical Authority in the UK on that.
Thanks, Emma. And now I want to come back to the AI issue, because Thomas, you mentioned a lot of ways in which new techniques, new technologies can be used to help analyze lots of this data in different ways and more reliable ways, but not removing the human entirely. And I really like this question from Mostafa, because I know from other events that we do that lots of civil servants are now using ChatGPT and things like Copilot to do all sorts of things in their day-to-day work. So Mustafa has asked, how reliable is it to use AI tools like Copilot or ChatGPT to analyze government program data and provide policy modifications? Ramil, I'll come to you. Would you advise people to use things like ChatGPT to analyze data?
Yeah, I think so. Right now in our organization, AI is yet to be used for policy making, but there are officers just like me that are more inclined and capacitated to use generative AI for policy making. And we are the exceptions, but I think this is if we do have the right data, if we have the right questions asked in Copilot or in ChatGPT, I think they are they are reliable enough. And of course, these data systems, this AI also work with whatever is available, and how
Mm.
reliable that available data is, that's gonna matter. So I think I am more inclined to use AI.
Thanks, Ramil. So you've said a yes, but as long as the
Yeah.
right questions are being asked and the right data is available for
Yes.
ChatGPT to use. Rob, would you be advising people to use those kind of tools as well?
I can't advise anyone on policy creation. That's not my remit. I think related to the question itself, Copilot, ChatGPT, Visa as an organization use both of those tools today. We've been using Copilot for about 6 months. It's a fabulous tool from a work productivity perspective. It does enable you to move through a lot of research and pull data points from within the organization together. The ChatGPT, Visa has a private version of ChatGPT so that we continue to train that model for us in terms of how it's used. But we're actually now using generative AI in terms of development of code as well internally, and that's really helping the developers that sort of build new capabilities within the organization to move at a much faster pace. Can that be used from a policy perspective? I would assume the same sort of issues of hallucination and fact checking is just as important in that instance as it would be in developing code. You've got to have the right framework around the use of the tool in the first place. But I think it would be foolish to avoid it as a tool to help governments to continue to move faster, because I think the private sector is also playing with it to help them move faster as well. So I think there's going to be a lockstep movement required for everyone to sort of keep pace.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I like the fact that Robert asked, was this the first ever cat that we've had on a GGF webinar? And Thomas has replied saying maybe not the first, but certainly the best. So I can say there have been other cats, but it was a little while ago now. So, but I won't argue with you that it was the best, Thomas. So we've got two final questions. I'm going to come to these. I really like this question from Simon Gillen, who has asked, do you ever find a generational divide within policymakers in terms of the profile of the people from ministries who ask for data? And do you think this has an impact on the extent to which data can be used to maximum effect? So are different generations asking for different types of data? Anybody like to answer that question, or have you not noticed a difference? I'm going to give anyone the chance.
I'll take a
Yeah,
first grab at it.
sure.
So we speak to government agencies around the world, and there's always a level of data curiosity. Who's done this before? What insights have there been? How has that impacted how policy has been applied? So I think the generational divide might refer to the people who are able to get at the data, to get the insights, versus the people who are curious to understand and use data to form their views or to measure performance or to monitor health and activity. So I think a lot of senior executives these days know that they've got to have good fact-based decisioning, and data plays a very important role in that.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Anybody else on the generational
Yeah,
question?
I hope that the situation is also much like what Sir Robert is saying here in the Philippines. Right now, big data is something that we are still dreaming of using. It's not yet fully appreciated there is a generational divide, and much of our higher management still more into traditional data, but we do want to prepare for big data use, and I hope that we can have the infrastructure for this.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ramil. And actually, it wasn't a question that came in. It was a comment from Aslak, which has come in, echoing a lot of what you said there about the use of new technologies, large language models, and including AI as well, saying that they've seen organizations kind of struggle with creating effective challenge statements and proper evidence-based and measurable outcome indicators as well. And if you don't have those, then actually, it limits the extent to which some of those new technologies are useful, I think.
So if you don't mind me saying, with those of us that have worked in IT development and data development for a while, we know that that's nothing new. Getting the client to write their business questions or their business requirements in a readable and understandable, comprehensive way, you're always going to struggle. If they can't formulate it right for you, why would they be able to formulate it right for a machine?
Yeah, this has been a question for a long time. And Emma, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. I thought I might just come in on the generational thing. I'm inclined to agree with Rob. There's an expectation in, that evidence, that policy is evidence-based, and I don't necessarily see a big generational divide in terms of the demand for evidence. I think probably where we anticipated a little bit of a shift as we went through a recent general election in the UK is more in how people are accessing evidence and the sort of the speed and the ability that they're expecting to access it. So, like a lot of ministers now, we expect will want to be able to access data on their mobile phone, for example, and in a nice, easy to visualize way, rather than in, sort of pages and pages of briefing that kind of sets out the evidence base. And so that's something that we are kind of thinking about in terms of how we service government. But yeah, I'd say sort of generally, I don't think there's a huge shift in demand.
Thanks, Emma. And I'm looking at the clock, and I think that has taken us to the end of our time. That conversation has gone very quickly and has been really, really interesting. Thank you to all of you. I think some of the key things I've noted down are just how important data is in this world where ministers are having to make these quite quick decisions with very limited resources as well. Getting those insights from data really important. How now people are looking for lots of different types of data, so some of the traditional sorts of data with some of this more real-time, quicker data. The point that Emma just ended on there, how accessible we can make data for non-data specialists, really, really important, so they can get to those insights quickly. And how some of these new tools, which everybody's excited about, things like AI, are only going to be as good as the data that those tools are using. So the human as well, really important in terms of they need to know the question that they are trying to answer as well. So we can't remove the human from any of these processes and conversations. Thank you so much to the audience for sending in those great questions. Thank you to our fantastic panel, to Thomas, to Ramil, to Emma, and to Robert. Thanks for giving us so much of your time and your expertise and insights today. To the audience, we've sent you a very short questionnaire. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes just to answer that questionnaire, it means we can continue to give you webinars on exactly the kinds of topics you are most interested in and that will be most useful to you. Thank you to Visa for being our knowledge partner today. We will be sending a link with today's conversation with this video to everybody who registered. So if you weren't able to watch all of it or you want to share it with some of your colleagues, you will be able to do that. The link will also be up on our website. And in a short while, we will also be producing a write-up with the key points that were raised in today's conversation, which we will share with everyone as well. But finally, thanks again to our great panel, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon on another one of our webinars. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
So much.